Hello, everyone. Today, I have a pleasure of speaking with another wonderful practitioner. And today, it's Isabelle Griffith, who is a somatic coach who specializes in emotional resilience and embodied feminine leadership. Hello, Isabelle.
Hi, Aneta. Thank you for having me. It's
Oh,
a real pleasure.
thank you for taking time for this conversation. I mean, we've had conversations before, and every time I
Mm.
absolutely love chatting with you. So thank you for being here.
And
And
I was going to say it's a pleasure. And also, I'm really conscious of the fact that we met, a few years ago talking about your vision for this podcast. So it feels quite special to be here and almost like a full circle moment. As I'm a big fan of your work, as you know. So I'm really excited to be here. Really excited.
thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. That's very true. Yes, we actually had a first call because somebody connected us because you were running a podcast and I wanted to. I
Yeah, I
think that
know.
was like 4 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a while ago, probably 4 years. Yeah.
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 So thank you so much for being here. And I'd love to start really asking you, how did you end up doing this kind of work? How did you end up working as a somatic coach, specializing in emotional resilience and embodied feminine leadership?
Mm. Yeah, it's a good question. And like probably most practitioners, I guess it's a bit of a story of undoing within myself that led me to this work, like many of us, I think. So um, before I came to this work, I spent over 20 years in the corporate world, different roles, different companies, managing, at the end, quite large teams across continents, early morning calls with Southeast Asia, late calls with the US. I had 2 young children at the time, and I can't tell you how many times I was driven to the station in the morning by my husband in tears, really experiencing that push and pull and the inner conflict of wanting, to pursue the career that I'd been building for so long, but also this real yearning to spend more time with my children. And I just couldn't reconcile them both. And most of the time I felt like I was drowning. Um, and so that lasted for quite a few years. Again, my body was, showing signs and saying, you're exhausted. You cry when you dropped off at the station in the morning. You have that inner conflict all the time. There's a real dissonance. This isn't right. But I couldn't see any other possibility. And then eventually my body shut down and I had a severe burnout. So I now have the vocabulary to say that it was a burnout, but at the time I really didn't know what was going on. I had no idea. And it was quite terrifying because my whole life came crashing down. My sense of self just shattered in a million pieces. I had no idea who I was, and I was lost and numb and confused. And it felt like my mind was a really hostile place. Like I was at war with myself. That really harsh inner critical voice was so active. And so being with myself felt really difficult. And at the time, the only moments that I felt a bit of ease were when I was on my yoga mat. I was attending a yoga class. I'd been doing yoga for quite a few years by then, but in that period, in that season of my life, that was my everything. It was like the raft at sea that I could hang on to, because only in those moments when I was on my mat and moving my body could I feel a sense of it's okay to be me. And for a lot of people, that's maybe how they live their life. But for me at the time, it was just that moment in my week. And and I know, having studied somatics and nervous system regulation and embodiment and all of these things, that I was in a dissociated state. I was in a functional freeze for a long time. And really, yoga was an invitation back into my body and into feeling. And it was as though it was sort of thawing the ice within me. But that didn't happen overnight. It took some time, and it was a real journey of kind of piecing myself back together. And it was so powerful for me that I then trained as a yoga teacher, and then as a mindfulness and self-compassion teacher. And I would teach yoga classes, and for me, it was always about not so much the poses, but really taking that moment and connecting with yourself. And people would come afterwards, after the class, and, share what they were going through and ask me for advice. And I felt completely inequipped to be advising anyone on anything. And so I decided to train as a coach, and I started training in, I suppose, more standard modalities like NLP and transactional analysis. And then as we met, embodiment, somatics, and nervous system, sort of trauma-informed approaches. And I think I've found my place in the somatics and embodiment realm, because really, to me, that's opened up so much. The returning to my body has been everything. And as we both know, we are suffering as a society so much, in part because we are disconnected from our body. And to me, if we're disconnected from our body, we're disconnected from our feelings. We might, again, I didn't experience joy, or I was just like a flat line emotionally. We disconnected from, our feeling and sensations, but we also disconnected from each other, and we disconnected from our environment. And it's such a tragic, I think, way to live when all of this is available to us. So that's how I came to this work, and I'm just really passionate about it.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that, and this is what I love about you. It comes through. It's the wisdom of your experience of going through something that was very difficult, hitting burnout, living that disconnected life, and then paying the price, which was your burnout, and then further kind of disconnection, and then healing journey, and the learning journey, and the growth. And whenever I speak with you, it always shows, like, I know that you've gone through it. I know that you're not just saying those words, but they are embodied within you, that you are walking that talk, that you understand what happened to you, and what the healing took place as well. And something that you said in here about the language, like, now, because of your training, because of your learning, because of your own practices and growth, the learning, the language, you understand what happened to you. But at the time, you didn't. You just knew that you felt in a certain kind of way, and you understood, on a visceral level, on every level of your experience, that being on that yoga mat and doing those practices gave you that window of connection, of being at ease. And I love the words that you used, that it was okay to be you. That's such powerful stuff. Just hearing that, it really kind of like, wow, this is so big. And I'm sure this is, from my experience of working with other women and my own experience, I know that so many of us experience that and go through that. And really, many of us struggle alone.
Yeah. And had I not, maybe had a yoga practice or come to mindfulness and then embody, maybe I would still be struggling alone. I think you're right. It's really the sense of, it's not okay to be me, or I'm not enough on some level. We so many of us have that narrative on some level that, I mean, for years, Annette, years, I lived with the narrative of, I am so flawed that there's no way I can be fixed. And of course, that language means that we go into that quest to fixing ourselves, because if something's wrong with us, if we're not enough, if, we're failing on some level. And burnout, often we look and we think everybody else is doing fine. I'm failing. This is a failure of my own. So do I need more evidence that I'm flawed again? I think so many of us go through life with that narrative of, there's something wrong with me. And it is, again, it's so heavy to carry that. And actually, again, the world of somatics and embodiment have really taught me to appreciate that there may be a part of us that's feeling really lost, that's feeling really confused, that's feeling like it's not enough. And there's so much more. There are other parts of us that know, that have wisdom, that are enough. And I think if we can sort of really sort of embrace the richness of who we are and see beyond that narrative, then so many doors open. And the most important being just feeling whole and at home within ourselves, and learning to integrate these parts of us that we've kind of pushed away. Because, again, if I have a narrative of I'm flawed or I'm bad, I'm going to be doing all I can to sort of conceal that from the world. And that will mean I need to hide the parts of me that don't seem to be perfect or are unsavory for human consumption. So yes, just, from that separation and disintegration, it's really a journey of embracing, I think. And when we can embrace those parts of us that we've disowned, it shifts everything. It shifts the sense of wholeness that we experience, and therefore we're no longer at the mercy of everything around us to validate that we are in fact not broken and that we're whole.
I love that, what you just said. It's such a different perspective, isn't it, coming from and acting and making choices from that place of I'm not good enough, and being in that survival mode, and concealing all of this and pretending, and maybe making choices about our health and well-being and relationship and work from that space, as opposed to that space of wholeness.
Yes.
And actually, embracing who we are. Really, for me, when I hear you say that, there is something about being human. And not just human, but also being a woman within the society that we live in right now. And understanding, when you start unpicking it, it's like we talk about, Gabor Mate talks really nicely about the myth of normal. And then, but we can go even deeper, isn't it? I mean, in the context of that embodied feminine leadership and embodied feminine itself, once you start unpicking it and looking, well, I am a woman and I live in this society, and the roles that I have to play as a woman, the kind of expectations of me from everybody around me and the society, the messages. Before we started this call, we were talking about the social media, the impact of this. You mentioned also, it might seem like everybody's doing really great. Look at all those amazing pictures and photos and on social media. They're all smiling. They're all in great places. They're all having amazingly healthy meals and drinks. And here is me, and I am struggling, and I feel alone, and I feel disconnected, and I feel not good enough. And it can give perception of, like what you said, that I'm the only one who's struggling. Everybody else has got it sorted out. They worked it out exactly what they needed to do, and here I am alone and not good enough. And so I wanted to kind of ask a little bit about this embodied feminine leadership. Is it all this kind of I'm embodied feminine and all these lovely pictures and love and light and or is it maybe something else?
Well, maybe it can be that, but I think it's a much, much deeper piece. And to me, it's really a journey to reclaim, ourselves, our bodies, our connection with the body, our somatic intelligence, and reconnect with that sense of inner sovereignty. Like cultivating that self-energy of knowing that, yes, there may be parts of me who feel a certain way, and there's also a part of me that can be in self-leadership and in self-sovereignty here, so that we reclaim the sense of authorship over our life, over our impact, and the imprint that we want to leave in the world. But it starts with creating that really stable inner foundation where our nervous system returns back to a state of homeostasis where we are finding inner safety in ourselves, and where we can then, once we find that sense of stability and leadership within ourselves, we can almost radiate a different way of being in the world. Because my perspective is that, leadership isn't confined to the corporate headquarters and the organizations, and it's also not something where we step in leadership when we're at work and then we step out of leadership when we're at home. It's very much, to me, a quality of being. And embodied feminine leadership is about cultivating this certain quality of being that starts with nervous system regulation, being present in our body, being authentic, and leading as a way of being. So really, our way of being is a way of leading. And I talk about embodied feminine leadership, but with a very broad view of leadership. We are all leaders because we touch everybody we meet in some ways every day. And we've talked about the dandelion before. As you touch that person, you just can't know how far that ripple will go. I think we've all had moments where we felt like we had a bad day, and maybe we go and get a coffee at the coffee shop, and that person is extra kind. Like, I've definitely had that experience where they could tell that I was having a bad day and they said, "It's on us today." And you think, that gesture of kindness that day is everything. To me, that's leadership. It's really about who we are choosing to be and being in the world as a way of leading, but from a place of being rooted in our own wholeness, in our intrinsic self-worth, in our nervous system capacity, so that we can hold other people. And teachers are leaders because, they impart knowledge onto children that will maybe serve them for years to come. Mothers are leaders, and fathers, raising children. Yoga teachers standing in, I know firsthand, if I hadn't received the leadership from that yoga teacher, I don't know where I'd be. And people working in communities to raise funds for those who are less fortunate, or to even come together in celebration. So again, when I talk about embodied feminine leadership, to me, it's a personal journey. It's a doorway and an invitation that we presented with at some point in our life, and it's a movement. Because as we are embracing that way of being, we become part of a network of co-regulated nervous system, and of women who are choosing to have to step fully into who they are, and therefore have a completely different impact in the world. Does it make sense?
Yeah, completely. I love it. You speak my language completely.
Yeah.
I love speaking with you. And yes, we did talk about that dandelion effect in the past. And as you just said, we never know how we're gonna impact somebody, and that kind of domino effect of how we are engaging, how we are in this process and this dance of co-regulation or dysregulation, and everything that we say will have impact, because we can't separate individual from the environment, and we are part of each other's environment, really.
Yeah.
And you're talking about that word leadership. Do you consider yourself a leader? And when I ask that in my training certifications, people normally say no.
Yeah.
Or women, and men normally say no, even though they are practitioners already, even though they are teachers, coaches or yoga teachers or wellness practitioners, even though they are very clearly seen by their communities within their work and their clients as leaders. Yet there is still this resistance of, I don't want to call myself a leader. And it comes with so many different connotations and expectations. And I guess for me, if I think about this, when I went through that process of really embracing the responsibility and accountability of, leadership and embracing it fully, for me, the thing that was coming up the most, I had the most resistance towards it, because of the examples that we see within our governments, within positions of power, of how people behave who are called leaders, and for all of us to watch, and really feeling quite, I guess, despondent to some level of not being able to change it or impact it, but really witnessing it all. And I think that's the challenge, isn't it, with that word,
I
leadership or
think
leader.
you've hit the nail on the head. I think from my experience of working with women, and being in, more traditional leadership in the workplace, there's a real paradox, because on the one hand, women may want to be leaders and to embrace that sense of creating an impact, and they don't identify with what's been called leadership up until this point. They don't want to be a part of that. They don't want to pay the price that comes with embracing leadership in that way, which often means, a very more of a maybe ego-driven type of leadership, quite harsh, forward pushing, going at all costs, hyper productive, because often the sacrifices, what I shared before, we end up burning out, losing parts of ourselves, and that's not a price that's worth paying. And I think, again, when I talk about this work being a movement, I really believe that, it's an opportunity to redefine what leadership is and to redefine a different way of leading. And I think, again, when we look at some research, we know even in the workplace that the kind of leadership that women have exhibited through the pandemic, for example, which is much more compassionate and human and, taking care of people, leads to better outcomes. And so we know that the world needs more of that. And I think it's just being willing and brave enough to redefine what leadership means for us and create our own experience of leadership, our own expression of leadership that we can identify with. But it takes bravery. And that's why, sometimes, often being held in community is really important. Like, I find I need to be in community with other women because it reminds me of that gentler and yet very powerful way of being. And it helps me to marinate in that way to sort of counterbalance what we see in the world. It takes bravery because it's tapping into really what feels true to you and bringing that outwardly and meeting our growth edge, because it's going to be uncomfortable. You talked about the sort of experience of being raised in a women's body and women's narratives earlier. And ultimately, I think we end up with a narrative that says it isn't safe to be fully who I am. And if it isn't safe to be fully who I am, and what I'm seeing leadership to be is this version of leadership that I don't identify with, I'm going to have to not only come out of myself and, be more fully me, but come out and step more boldly into myself by becoming a leader. And that's scary. And that's why the nervous system work is really important and the embodiment work is really important, because we can't ever grow faster than our nervous system's capacity to embrace our vision. It takes, and that's also why, and we talked about this before, we need to start at the level of our nervous system when we begin this journey into, embodied feminine leadership or any journey really. Because if we jump to, let's say somebody is in the workplace and they want to be promoted, but all sorts of things are coming up, going straight to, let's look at strategies for you to be more visible isn't going to work because the nervous system capacity isn't there. Or as an entrepreneur or a practitioner, again, just taking that step to be more visible on social media, we're just going to pull ourselves back all the time. And I've been there myself. So that nervous system capacity and really being anchored in ourselves is the number one priority. And from there, we can create that new flavor of leadership. And it takes time for that also to percolate, I think, for us to recognize what that flavor is. It takes time and experimentation and
Yeah, time plays a big part in all of this, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
with the embodiment, with nervous system regulation, with healing, with post-traumatic growth, there isn't a shortcut. There isn't a one, do a swoosh
No, no.
method and it's done and it's fixed and it's released and we
Yes.
can say so many things and use the language in that way, but the reality of it is that if you want to become embodied and more within the nervous system regulation and stability and presence, it really takes time, doesn't it? It's like baby
Yeah.
steps work.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think it's really the same with leadership, isn't it? It's like sometimes when people step up too quickly into those roles, or they haven't done the inner work themselves, they do not have that capacity to hold it
No.
and to become who they need to become in order for it to work in
Yes.
a way that it needs to work.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because I think, again, as we move from healing to self-leadership to leadership, then we need to develop that capacity to, first of all, be within ourselves and rooted in, but also be in resonance with someone else. And that's a skill. And obviously we also need to elevate our self-concept and self-actualize to meet who we need to be to embrace that role. And I've seen it so many times, somebody who's a great individual contributor within an organization, but the moment they have stepped into that leadership role, everything collapsing, because they haven't given them time to sort of do the identity work, really become that leader. And it takes time. But going back to what you were saying right at the start, saying that you've experienced it and you've really lived through this, I think the only way to become is by being and becoming. Do you know what I mean? We can't become without becoming. It's a bit like saying, I want big muscles tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's great. But then even if we did have those big muscles tomorrow, we haven't done the inner work, in this case, our inner muscles, to be able to maintain that. It's a continuous growth process. And I think the gems and the growth is in the becoming.
Yeah.
It's not in the having become. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and as human beings, there is that life forward movement. We are always in the process of becoming, unless obviously we go into the freeze and, those states where we are in complete survival, which is okay. All the states are important, and sometimes, we need to do that in order to survive, but to live in that kind of space, in that state, can be very painful long term.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, Isabelle, so what would be if somebody's listening and, wants to follow in your footsteps and to do the kind of work that you are doing, what would be your one piece of advice to them?
Well, I think there's the first piece would be the becoming. I think we can't do this work without, we can't do this work as a practitioner without doing this inner work ourselves. And I think I really believe in this idea of doorways. So for me, burnout was a doorway into this work. And I think we all presented with doorways quite regularly. But sometimes we're just not receptive to that doorway. And a doorway can be an illness. So it can be a deep yearning that we can't quite articulate. It can be a separation from a partner or a challenging event in our life. And I think if you have any kind of glimmer of a doorway, my first advice would be crack the door open. Don't let the doorway go closed again, because this could be the first day of the rest of your life. And really, these doorways are, in some ways, I think, our body often nudging us towards doing something differently. So I would say, if you are presented with a doorway, crack the door open and give yourself time to explore what that could be like. And that leads me to maybe my second advice, which would be give yourself time to sit with yourself. And excuse me, that could be in meditation, that could be in walking, that could be in movement. Again, for me at the time, it was yoga. And to really give yourself time to feel into what you are desiring, where you are, and what that yearning is, because it's somewhere within you and only you know what it is. And so just doing it with patience, holding the space between being and becoming and the not knowing for a while. But I think that's the first piece. If you want to be doing this work, there's something nudging you, becoming curious about that thing and sitting with it and really understanding what's driving you forward, because that's the fuel that drives us ultimately. So that's what I would say. And then maybe do the trainings and then maybe make decisions. But first, sit with the yearning. Because I think if we if we don't sit with the yearnings and we go back to, thinking and analyzing and reflecting, my path, I should take these 3 steps, we're going to be taking the wrong path, most likely, because we're going to be optimizing for what feels logical, but not necessarily for what we deeply yearn for. So sit with the yearning.
Yeah, I love that. What came up for me, it's such a more embodied and feminine approach rather than, let's do pros and cons,
Yes.
write it all out and kind of, what would be the most, accepted next step. And it's this kind of tuning in to your inner wisdom, really seeing, because ultimately, I mean, it always comes back for me, it's like ultimately you only got one life. The time passes really quickly. I just turned 50 a few weeks back. It's like, how did that happen? It's
I
just
agree.
a while ago, I was 18-year-old girl in London, and now suddenly I'm 50. I'm here, my body is changing, my life is different, all of those different things. So when we kind of look at that, it's within the context of everything that is happening. Something for me, what comes up is this sacredness of life, the sacredness of me being who I am and you being who you are, and how we can embrace it, how we can cherish it, how we can celebrate it, and how we can step into what you were just talking about, that calling. There's something that is greater than ourselves, something that really will guide us if we allow it to guide us, if we open to that. Yeah.
Beautifully said. And I've lost my voice.
Oh. Oh, thank you, Isabelle. It's always such a pleasure. And I just wanted also to say, if anybody is interested in this kind of work, I have a real pleasure of collaborating with Isabelle in the big training that I'm doing. And Isabelle also is doing lots of trainings herself and set up a school of embodied feminine leadership.
Somatic leadership for women. Close. Yeah. I'm
So,
really looking forward to our collaboration.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, I think it's what you just said earlier. What I really want to celebrate is this women coming together and really creating those environments where we hold for each other permission, because at the beginning we can't hold permission for ourselves, and we need other women to hold that space for us, to give us permission to acknowledge how we fully feel, the challenges, also the opportunities, and really to step up into who we can become in various different, you were talking about different kind of areas of our lives, the work and the corporate and the relationships and the personal life, and with our children, with our partners, with our parents. There's so much richness in here. So Isabelle, thank you so much, but before we finish, I'd love you to just share where people can find more about your work, if they wanted to reach out and do some work with you or follow you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I think the best place, apologies, my voice is just, I have something stuck in my throat. Um, the best place is the School of Somatic Leadership for Women.com to find more about my work. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn if you are on LinkedIn. My handle is Isabelle Wies, Wies, and then Griffith with no S at the end. But yes, thank you so much for having me. It's been, as usual, a really rich and insightful conversation, and I'm always grateful for the time that we spend together. Thank you,
Uh,
Aneta.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And I'm really looking forward to collaborating more and growing more and seeing, and creating that movement. I love that word, that movement, to really make the world um, a more accessible and safer place. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. Thank you, Aneta.
Thank you, Isabel.